chapter 13. Get it to sit up. There we go. Religious freedom and persecution. Section 1. In Iran, converting to Christianity is a potentially deadly decision. It was especially so for Saeed Abedini because he wanted to tell people about it. Wherever he went, he talked about Jesus. Iranian authorities were so angry that even after Saeed married and moved to America to raise a family, they didn't forget. They banned him from publicly evangelizing in Iran. For Saeed, life in America was safe. Too easy, even. He remembered the faces of the young Iranians so eager to hear about Christ. They were fed up with Islamic radicalism. They hungered for truth. While Saeed was forbidden from publicly evangelizing, authorities there did agree to let him start an orphanage. Leaving Idaho in the summer of 2012, Saeed flew back to Iran. At home with their 2 young children, Saeed's wife, Nagma, anticipated his phone call in the following weeks, sharing what God had been doing. Instead, in September, she received horrifying news. In spite of the Iranian government's promise, Saeed was placed under house arrest. Subsequently, he was sentenced to 8 years in one of Iran's most notorious prisons for sharing his Christian faith. Saeed suffered immensely in prison. He was tortured and denied medical treatment because the doctors and nurses considered him an unclean infidel. Other prisoners began asking about his devotion to Christ, and some of them even had dreams in which Jesus appeared. Even though prison officials beat Saeed for sharing his faith, he continued to do so, and many people, from fellow prisoners to hospital workers, came to Christ. While explaining why the Iranians were reluctant to release Saeed, a U.S. government official told Nagma, "He's making it hard. He just keeps sharing Christ wherever, and the Iranian government is just pretty frustrated about that." Nagma replied, "Well, he's not doing it out of defiance. He's doing it out of his passion for Christ." She then shared with the government official how Jesus Christ had changed Saeed's life and told the official that the Iranian government could always kick him out of the country. After 3 years of wrangling and an unbearably high cost to his family, Saeed Abedini was finally released from prison in January of 2016. Unfortunately, Saeed's case isn't unique. The respected Pew Forum on Religion and Public Life says that more than 70% of the world's population lives under regimes that severely restrict religious freedom, and in countries around the world, Christians suffer government harassment more than any other religious group. Sadly, attacks on religious freedom are accelerating even in Western countries, including the United States. Over the past decade, U.S. federal and state government actions have established a dangerous trend of intentionally restricting religious freedom. Christian groups on college campuses have been forced to either accept people as leaders who may not support the group's Christian mission or leave campus. Pharmacists who object to pills that lead to chemical abortions have been forced to stock them anyway. Religious foster care programs that object to placing children with same-sex couples or unmarried opposite-sex couples have had their charities, licenses, and contracts revoked. Business owners, such as bakers, florists, and wedding photographers, have been sued, fined, and even driven out of business for declining to provide services to same-sex marriage ceremonies because this would violate their Christian beliefs. The business owners in question all provided services to same-sex attracted people as individuals without discrimination, but saw the support of same-sex weddings as a separate issue and a violation of their consciences. New York City has banned religious groups from renting public school auditoriums. Anti-religious groups are taking down crosses erected as memorials to the war dead in places like Camp Pendleton in Southern California. The U.S. Air Force has stopped providing Bibles at its lodging facilities, has removed the word God from its logos, and has withdrawn its support of the Operation Christmas Child charity at the Air Force Academy. While these attacks on religious expression haven't yet led to physical violence or overt persecution, they point to a potentially dangerous and growing intolerance of religion. Sociologists Brian Grimm and Roger Fink have demonstrated a direct link between governmental and social restrictions on religion and religious persecution and conflict. When governments restrict religion, anti-religious groups become bolder at opposing and even attacking those with whom they disagree. Leaders who ignore the issue of religious liberty are playing with fire. They are unraveling a basic freedom that has led to unprecedented liberty and prosperity around the world. While a lot of Christians are concerned about fellow believers being harassed and tortured and killed for their faith, most don't see how they can make a difference. As conflicts accelerate, Christians need to understand the problem and act on behalf of our suffering brothers and sisters around the world, as well as prepare to defend freedom in our own nation. As we'll see in this chapter, religious freedom is the first domino. If it falls, so will other freedoms. It is imperative to grasp what religious freedom is, what constitutes the scourge of persecution, and what Christians can do to make a difference. 2. Defining the problem. So what is religious freedom? Religious freedom is the right of all human beings to think as they please, believe or not believe as their conscience leads, and live out their beliefs openly, peacefully, and without fear. Article 18 of the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights says, "Everyone has the right to freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. This right includes freedom to change his religion or belief, and freedom either alone or in community with others and in public or private to manifest his religion or belief in teaching, practice, worship, and observance. To live in dignity where people must be able to follow the leading of their consciences. To live in dignity, people must be able to follow the leading of their consciences. If we're coerced into saying we believe something we don't, our integrity is violated because we're being forced to lie. If we're compelled to refrain from acting on what we do believe, we can't live authentically. In either case, truth, honesty, trust, creativity, and thought all suffer. Rights that protect the body but not the mind fail to account for what it means to be human. We must be free in our minds in order to be truly free. In this sense, the right to religious freedom is the most basic right of all. Of course, governments may restrict rights when it's necessary to protect public safety, order, and health. To use the classic example from Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr., having the freedom of speech doesn't mean you have the right to falsely shout fire in a crowded theater, because such a lie can hurt people as they try to escape. Similarly, you don't have a right to exercise the freedom of religion in a way that restricts the religious freedom of others. For example, by bringing blasphemy charges against someone whose view of God differs from your own. Restriction of religious freedom leads to persecution. According to the U.S. International Religious Freedom Act of 1998, religious persecution occurs when a nation arbitrarily prohibits, restricts, or punishes people for assembling for peaceful activities such as worship, preaching, and prayer, speaking freely about one's religious beliefs, changing one's religious beliefs and affiliation, possessing or distributing religious literature, including Bibles, or raising one's children in the religious teachings and practices of one's choice. Religious freedom requires tolerance, a word that needs to be carefully defined. Today, tolerance is often used to imply that everyone is right or that no one is wrong. A better definition of tolerance is respecting the dignity of all people, including those we think are wrong. If we want the freedom to practice our religion free from persecution, then we must protect those freedoms for others. The right to religious freedom has often not been protected in history. Religious persecution has been common, and even though we've made many advances in the world, religious persecution is still growing today. We need to understand what caused persecution in the past and what is causing it today in order to know how to stand up for the oppressed and safeguard our own freedoms. What causes religious persecution? Religious persecution doesn't just happen. It occurs when people are antagonistic toward one or more religious groups because they believe that people shouldn't be allowed to disagree with the dominant religion. According to sociologist Rodney Stark, if lots of religious groups are accepted in a culture, religious conflicts rarely move beyond debate or name-calling. When one religion monopolizes power and insists on obedience, though, it begins to challenge the political power of the state. That religion then begins to force itself on the nation, and as Stark puts it, heresy inevitably becomes treason. What caused religious persecution in the past? It's happened often in history, such as with Donatism, Albigensianism, I have no idea how to say those words, and the wars of religion. I will be looking them up afterwards. And the wars of religion in Europe between the early 1500s and the mid-1600s. According to historian Thomas Kidd, in the medieval period, Europeans had simply assumed that a union between church and state and the persecution of those who challenged it was a natural, even God-sanctioned state of affairs. The tension between church and state, for instance, led to inquisitions, in which church and government leaders put people on trial for heresy and punished them if they weren't judged to be sufficiently devout. There have been several inquisitions in history that involved widespread abuses, even torture. The medieval Inquisition, for example, was established in the late 12th century in response to the Albigensians, also called the Cathari, a group the religious authorities of the day deemed heretical. Pope Innocent III sent a representative to restore the Albigensians to the good graces of the church, but the representative was assassinated. In response, the Pope raised an army and conquered the Albigensians. Then he set up an inquisition to deal with the remaining heretics. This particular inquisition also caught in its net a group called the Waldensians, another Christian sect the Pope deemed heretical. Eventually, the medieval Inquisition expanded even further, targeting the Knights Templar and the Beguines, a women's lay religious group thought to be tied to heretical groups. Today, critics of Christianity point to historical inquisitions as proof that Christians hypocritically insist on religious freedom for themselves, but deny it for those with whom they disagree. It's not a Christian problem, though. It happens when any religion, including Islam, Hinduism, and Buddhism, becomes dominant enough to use the state's power to enforce religious decrees. When this occurs, what is central to that religion's teaching often becomes irrelevant, and brute government force takes over. Ironically, when the government gets involved in religion, bless you, the church has often had to rescue people from the events it set in motion. For example, historian Thomas Madden says that one of the purposes of the Inquisition was to rehabilitate those accused of heresy so they wouldn't be executed for treason. Madden notes that heresy was a crime against the state. Roman law in the Code of Justinian made it a capital offense. When someone was accused of heresy in the early Middle Ages, they were brought to the local lord for judgment, just as if they had stolen a pig or damaged shrubbery, which was actually a serious crime in England. Yet, in contrast to those crimes, it was not so easy to discern whether the accused was really a heretic. For starters, one needed some basic theological training, something most medieval lords sorely lacked. The result is that uncounted thousands across Europe were executed by secular authorities without fair trials or a competent assessment of the validity of the charge. Madden also notes that mobs sometimes killed people accused of heresy. During the Spanish Inquisition, some of the accused were so afraid of what the government or mobs would do to them that they purposefully blasphemed so they could be transferred to the church courts, which seemed more fair and humane. Something similar happened in the witch trials. For most of the Middle Ages, there was very little belief in witches. The witch trials only got going in the 1400s when government authorities began identifying witchcraft with magic, magic with the devil worship with heresy, and heresy is a type of treason. Some have claimed that 9 million witches were executed in witch trials between the 1400s and 1600s. The actual total is probably closer to 60,000, or between 150 and 300 a year, during the time the fervor lasted. Such witch trials ended in the aftermath of the execution of 19 accused witches during the Salem witch trials in Massachusetts. Horrified, respected ministers Deodat Lawson, Increase Mather, and Samuel Willard joined with the governor, Sir William Phipps, to bring the trials to an end. It seems, though, that the world has learned very little from history. Religious persecution not only still exists, but is growing, and most of its victims are Christians. What causes religious persecution today? When a few powerful religious organizations exist and are fighting for political power, it's usually small, non-threatening religious groups that are hurt most. This is what happened with Jews in Europe in the 11th century, who were victims of a low tolerance for all non-Christian groups during the conflict between Christianity and Islam. Sometimes, so-called Christians participated in the violence, even though it was at odds with everything their Savior taught. Other Christians, though, worked to stem violence directed against Jews, for example, during the First Crusade and the Black Death. Today, Christians of all denominations are on the receiving end of religious intolerance, largely at the hands of Islamic governments and secular religions such as Marxism. Islam and Marxism are totalistic viewpoints, which means they see no separation between the church and the state and are thus comfortable demanding strict adherence to their religious worldviews as part of the cost of citizenship. Either way, Christians are in the crosshairs. Michael Horowitz says that historically Jews were the canaries in the coal mine. If a nation persecuted Jews, it was more likely to deny freedoms to others as well. But now Horowitz says the canaries are Christians. Let's see how this is so around the world and even in the United States, where religious persecution takes place in the world today. 3/4 of the world's population lives in countries with severe religious restrictions, according to the Pew Research Center. These countries regularly persecute Christians. In places like Burma and Eritrea, which are some of the worst persecutors of Christians, the government brutally cracks down on all those they view as a threat to their power. Because the allegiance of Christians to God is higher than their allegiance to the state, they often find themselves victimized. In 2015, says the watchdog group Open Doors, more than 7,000 Christians were killed for faith-related reasons. Christians, Buddhists, and Hindu nationalists have all been persecutors. But because Christians have experienced the worst persecution in the past 100 years at the hands of Muslims and Marxists, that's where we'll focus in the following discussion. Marxism. Marxism is based on the dictatorship of the proletariat. Marxist dictators justify their despotism by claiming to represent the interests of the workers, known as the proletariat, against those of the property owners, the bourgeoisie. Whatever helps the proletariat is right. Whatever helps the bourgeoisie is wrong. This is known as proletariat morality. Religion helps the bourgeoisie, Marxists think, in that priests convince the oppressed that their reward is in heaven to keep them from revolting against their oppressors in this life. Marxists consequently don't feel bad about stripping people of religious freedom. It's been this way from Marxism's beginnings. In the former Soviet Union, Marxists aggressively sought to eliminate the influence of the church. In the days following the October Revolution of 1917, Marxists discriminated against priests and tried to wipe out religion through state controls. On April 8, 1929, for example, the USSR enacted a law forbidding religious organizations from carrying out charitable activities or meeting at any other time than for religious service. In effect, Marxist sociologists declared war against the church, a conflict that continues to the present day wherever communists are in power. In the 1936 Soviet Constitution affirmed that all citizens were granted certain rights in conformity with the interests of the working people and in order to strengthen the socialist system. Citizens whose actions Marxist-Leninist leaders deemed unacceptable found themselves without any rights. Alexander Solzhenitsyn in the Gulag Archipelago and Stephanie Courtois and colleagues in the Black Book of Communism, Crimes, Terror, Repression, documented the loss of rights of those deemed enemies of the state. Religious people were among the most mistreated. In 1955, Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev said, "Communism has not changed its attitude of opposition to religion. We are doing everything we can to eliminate the bewitching power of the opium of religion." The Atheist Handbook was published in conjunction with Khrushchev's campaign to eliminate religion and used science to attack figures like Jesus and the Apostle Paul as mythical. All of this discrimination had a common source: atheism. From Marx's time to the present, communists everywhere have vehemently denied the existence of God. The Great Soviet Encyclopedia, published in Moscow in 1950, called on the Communist Party to oppose religion and to fight for the full victory of atheism. The Young Communist League's 10 Commandments contain the declaration, "If you are not a convinced atheist, you cannot be a good communist." Atheism is indissolubly bound to communism. Because it's based on a form of materialism, a belief that only the material world exists, a hatred of anything supernatural, especially of a Christian variety, comes easily to Marxists. Although the July 10, 1918 Constitution of the former USSR recognized freedom of both religious and anti-religious propaganda as the right of every citizen, the Soviet state constantly worked to suppress theistic religion. Article 4 of the 1918 Constitution declared monks and clergy of all denominations to be among those prohibited from voting or holding government office. Ultimately, they were denied ration cards, and their children were barred from attending school above the elementary grades. Church after church was declared counter-revolutionary and shut down, and church buildings were turned into cinemas, radio stations, granaries, museums, and machine repair shops. The 1936 Soviet Constitution also guaranteed freedom of religious worship, but Marxist attacks on religious people continued. Some Christians attempting to conform to the law registered with the government. In turn, they were required to collect 50 signatures of friends and neighbors who sympathized with them. When they presented the signatures, the government declared the signatories conspirators and counter-revolutionaries. Those who could be found were subsequently arrested. Similar persecution continues today in formerly Marxist countries that many in the West mistakenly assume have been reformed. Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Armenia, and Georgia all restrict religious freedom, grinding down believers and eroding the free expression of their faith. Belarus, a Soviet-like state, prevents Christians from worshiping freely because it damages traditional Belarus. The communist governments of Vietnam and Laos also brutally oppress Christians, especially those who insist on meeting together in groups. Cuba is no better. Dr. Oscar Elias Biscuit, a Christian human rights activist, was sentenced to 25 years in a Cuban prison for his opposition to abortion. He spent 10 years in solitary confinement, was denied access to a Bible, and was deprived of medical treatment. Pressure from the Catholic Church led to his release from prison, and he chose to stay in Cuba to continue the fight for human rights. Bisquet says, "My country continues to be run by a brutal regime that oppresses the people, systematically violating our basic freedoms. Government agents beat and imprison anyone seeking peaceful political change. They arbitrarily arrest and detain Cubans for Orwellian infractions like disrespecting patriotic symbols and insulting symbols of the fatherland. Cuban state security closely monitors citizens' daily life, including all of our incoming mail, telephone calls, and emails." Bisquet says Cuba restricts the press and sends journalists to jail who cross the party line. Having spent more than 12 years in Cuban jails himself, Bisquet describes them as living hells that flagrantly violate human dignity. For sheer evil, though, none of these regimes reaches the brutality of persecution found in the communist regime of North Korea. Respected journalist Melanie Kirkpatrick has written extensively of the plight of North Koreans who daily face nightmarish fear and hardship. Nearly 1 of every 100 North Koreans is locked in a prison camp for offenses that include disrespecting a photo of the supreme leader. Up to 1 million people have died in these hellish conditions, but these haven't been the only casualties. In a real-life example of Hunger Games brutality, North Korea's inept economic policies led to a man-made famine in the 1990s that killed up to 2.5 million people. Those who try to escape are virtually guaranteed death. In 2011, North Korea's young dictator Kim Jong-un issued a shoot-to-kill order to border guards if anyone tried to flee the country. Christians are especially singled out for persecution, which is particularly startling, given that until the mid-1900s, North Korea was a very Christian country. In the 1940s, so many Christians lived in Pyongyang, which is now the capital of North Korea, that it was nicknamed the Jerusalem of the East. As a teen, Kim Il-sung, the founder of North Korea's dictatorship, attended worship services with his parents, where he played the organ. When he came to power, however, he began an intensive program of repressing Christians, killing them, jailing them, or banishing them to remote areas of the country. Entire families have been put to death if a single family member possesses a Bible. Because China engages in so much international trade, many assume that it has been reformed from the bloodlust and terror that characterized the regime of Mao Zedong. Certainly things have improved, but the scale of persecution is still breathtaking. Christians who run afoul of laws restricting religion can be sent to prison or to laogai, re-education through labor camps, and they're often brutally detained without a trial or hearing. People who try to enter China to escape North Korean persecution are cold-heartedly returned to the North Koreans, which all but guarantees their torture and execution. China's one-child policy has also led to persecution. The government bans the church from teaching that an unborn child has a right to life. Even though China made a show of loosening the policy in 2013, people who desire to have more than one child are denied education, health care, and even marriage for their illegal children. Such families can face fines 10 times the average household income. Families who cannot or will not pay the fines can have their homes vandalized, and their young child might even be killed. Marxist countries brutally persecute Christians, but when all countries are taken together, the evidence is that the worst persecution of Christians in the world is in Muslim countries. Muslim apologists often portray Islam as a peaceful, tolerant religion. One Islamic scholar stated that humanity is one single family of God and there can be no sanction for barriers. Islam gives the revolutionary concept of the unity of mankind. The Quran supports religious freedom, says Abdullah Saeed, a professor of Islamic studies at the University of Melbourne in Australia, quoting such passages as "There shall be no coercion in matters of faith." Professor Said says that belief is a choice. Forced conversions are against Islam, and those who use force are disobeying the Quran. Most Islamic regimes act differently, however. In their comprehensive study of global persecution, Paul Marshall, Leila Gilbert, and Nina Shea state, the most widespread persecution of Christians today takes place in the Muslim world, and it is intensifying. Radical Islam's ultimate goal is a global Islamic state known as Pan-Islam, in which religious leaders rule, known as an Islamic theocracy, according to the principles of Sharia law. Sharia requires all Muslims to engage in jihad, which means resisting anything hindering the advance of Islam. Christians and Jews, known as people of the book, are called dhimmis. A dhimmi is expected to express submission to Muslim rulers by paying a tax called the jizya. Theoretically, as long as Christians and Jews pay the jizya and keep their views to themselves, they're granted what 8th century Islamic legal scholar Abdullah Yusuf Ali called their personal liberty of conscience. As we'll see shortly, the reality is very different. Violence against Christians and Jews is commonplace and even widely accepted in predominantly Muslim countries, and it's especially severe against Muslims who convert to Christianity. Uncomfortably for those who wish to view Islam as a religion of peace, and for many Muslims themselves who honestly desire to live in harmony with their neighbors, Islam has historically treated Christians as second-class citizens and, at its worst, has enslaved and slaughtered Christians and sought to destroy Christianity's holy sites. The persecution continues today. Here are some examples. In Saudi Arabia, state schools teach students to hate Christians and view them as enemies. Christian prayers are forbidden, even in private. In Iran, arrests of Christians are accelerating, and the regime considers them conspirators and parasites. In Egypt, the Coptic Christians, an ancient community the Apostle Mark established nearly 2,000 years ago, are attacked for insulting Islam. Its priests endure death threats. Coptic Christian homes have been tagged with crosses to make their inhabitants easier to harass. Even today, they are massacred. Converts to Christianity are threatened with jail time, marriage annulment, and having their children forcibly registered as Muslim. Pakistan forbids blasphemy against Islam, but doesn't spell out what counts as blasphemy. Christians have little defense against frequent false accusations based on business rivalry, property disputes, and grudges. Thugs and mobs, and even the police, have killed hundreds of people. Paul Marshall notes that Christians cannot effectively counter such charges against them because their testimony is of less legal worth than a Muslim's in Sharia courts. The testimony of a Christian woman is worth even less. Jordan, while not banning conversion to Christianity or evangelizing Muslims, puts all laws concerning religion, marriage, divorce, child custody, and inheritance under the jurisdiction of Sharia courts, in which Christians are denied full legal representation. In Afghanistan, according to a U.S. Department of State report, male citizens over age 18 or female citizens over age 16 of sound mind who converted from Islam had 3 days to recant their conversion or be subject to death by stoning, deprivation of all property and possessions, and the invalidation of their marriage. Iraq is such a hotbed of religious persecution that the country has now been included as one of the world's worst places for religious persecution on a recommended short list of countries of particular concern by the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom. In Turkey, a supposedly secular state, national security agencies have reportedly spied on Christians. They've also been threatened, attacked, hauled into court on bogus charges, and even brutally murdered by ultranationalists seeking to destabilize the government. Algeria, Yemen, the Palestine territories, and even the island nation of Indonesia, which styles itself as a democracy, have been known to turn a blind eye when Muslim mobs target Christians. Christians in Pakistan, Afghanistan, Iraq, Nigeria, Turkey, and Somalia have all died for their faith. Sometimes Muslims themselves are persecuted for blasphemy when expressing dissenting political or religious views. In 2014, a new form of Islamic persecution arose at the hands of a group called the Islamic State in Iran and Syria, known as ISIS, a terrorist organization with a growing army of fighters, numbering in the tens of thousands. ISIS zealously pursues a radical Islamist agenda with hundreds of millions of dollars in funding from oil revenue. Its fighters routinely enslave and gang rape women as young as 9 years of age and publicly torture and execute those ISIS believes are its enemies. Posted on the internet, these executions often have the perverse effect of encouraging Western young people to sympathize with the group's bloodthirsty aims. Frighteningly, many Western leaders have failed to grapple with the threat ISIS presents. They find it hard to acknowledge that ISIS is an explicitly religious group aiming to take over the world, even though the leader of ISIS, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, declared a global caliphate Islamic government in 2014 with himself as its leader. In just a one-year period following al-Baghdadi's announcement, more than 10,000 people were beheaded, shot, drowned, stoned, or thrown off buildings at the hands of ISIS fighters. Thousands more were killed in war actions and suicide bombings. Christians especially are the targets of ISIS, which has destroyed ancient Christian communities and forced Christians to either convert to Islam or die. In Syria, more than 600,000 Christians have been displaced, leading the New York Times to ask, is this the end of Christianity in the Middle East? Given the brutality we've just discussed, it seems juvenile to complain about relatively minor instances of religious persecution occurring in the United States. But America's unique and strong foundation of religious freedom is increasingly under attack. Historically speaking, when a society begins restricting religious freedom, coercive restrictions on other liberties follow. Historian Will Durant warned in another context, from barbarism to civilization requires a century. From civilization to barbarism needs but a day. It's like a dam that gives way little by little until it collapses entirely with catastrophic results. Attacks on religious freedom, even small ones, need to be taken seriously. And we shall stop there for a little bit.